My name is Philip. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the kind of person companies describe as reliable. Not visionary, not disruptive, reliable. I live in Chicago. I lead analytics for a mid sized tech firm that most people outside the industry have never heard of. Inside the company, though, our dashboards decide budgets, hiring, strategy, sometimes even reputations. Numbers don't raise their voices, they don't beg for attention. They simply sit there, waiting for someone to notice what they're saying. That's always been my space. If you met me at work, you probably wouldn't remember the conversation. I'm not loud. I don't dominate meetings. I don't interrupt. I listen. I take notes. I ask one or two questions that matter. Over time, people began to see me as stable background infrastructure, like the server room. Important, yes, but out of sight. There's a strange invisibility that comes with competence. When things run smoothly, no one asks why. They just assume they were always meant to. For years, I believed that was enough. Deliver clean results, hit targets, improve margins quietly, let performance speak. And to be fair, it did speak. The numbers proved my results. Quarter after quarter, my department outperformed projections. Revenue models tightened, forecast accuracy improved. Attrition in my team dropped to near zero. When executives needed clarity, they came to me. But clarity only matters when decisions are still being made. This story begins the day I gained temporary access to an internal restructuring dashboard, an administrative oversight during a system migration. I wasn't snooping. I was troubleshooting an anomaly in our headcount projections, and when the permissions window opened wider than it should have, I saw something I wasn't meant to see. My name, first on the layoff list. Despite being the top performer, the numbers proved my results, yet the list told another story. Performance didn't matter when decisions had already been made behind closed doors. What I felt in that moment wasn't anger, it was stillness. Because when you spend your life believing fairness is embedded in data, discovering it isn't can rearrange something deep inside you. This isn't a revenge story. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, no villains twirling mustaches in glass offices. It's about quiet realization, about what happens when you understand your value. At the same time, you understand how little it protects you. It's about the role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it. About the moment I stopped confusing silence with loyalty. And about what changes when silence becomes a choice instead of a habit. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, step by step. Not to expose anyone, not to dramatize corporate politics, but to be honest about how easily invisible people become expendable and how powerful they can become once they stop playing the role written for them. Have you ever discovered that your hard work mattered less than you thought it did? Before the list, before the system access, before the stillness, there was a version of me they had already decided on. To them, I was dependable, the numbers guy, the one who makes it make sense. In meetings, I sat halfway down the table, not at the head. That was reserved for executives who spoke in abstractions, not at the far end. That was for junior analysts trying to look invisible. I occupied the middle, both literally and professionally. When discussions got messy, budget disputes, missed targets, unrealistic projections, someone would eventually say, "Let's ask Philip." It sounded like respect. It wasn't. It was containment. I was brought in to validate, to clarify, to fix, not to shape direction, not to question the premise. My job was to translate ambition into spreadsheets and then quietly make those spreadsheets work. I rarely objected. Part of it was temperament. I've never needed credit. I grew up in a house where praise was quiet and expectations were loud. My father used to say, "If you're good at something, it's your responsibility, not your accomplishment." So I learned early to measure myself internally. At work, that translated into a simple philosophy: deliver undeniable results. And I did. When I took over the analytics division, forecasting error rates hovered around 18%. Within a year, we brought it down to 6%. Our churn prediction model improved retention by nearly 9%. Marketing spend became more efficient because we stopped chasing vanity metrics and focused on lifetime value. Executives loved the outcomes, but outcomes are strangely anonymous. In quarterly town halls, my CEO would say things like, "Thanks to cross-functional optimization, we've seen strong improvements in retention." Cross-functional optimization. That was me and my team, and 400 hours of re-architecting models from scratch. But I wasn't mentioned by name. I told myself it didn't matter. Recognition wasn't the goal. Stability was, growth was, building something sustainable was. Still, patterns reveal themselves if you're paying attention. When promotions were discussed, I was described as critical where he is. When strategic initiatives were launched, I was too valuable to reassign. When leadership offsites happened, I was needed to keep operations steady. Reliable, essential, immovable. It sounds flattering until you realize it's a cage. There's a specific kind of invisibility that high performers fall into. If you solve problems before they escalate, no one experiences the crisis you prevented. If your department runs cleanly, no one feels urgency to spotlight you. If you don't advocate loudly for yourself, the room assumes you're comfortable in the background. And I was comfortable, or at least I thought I was. I wore neutral suits. I kept my voice even. I documented everything in my black leather notebook. Meeting decisions, shifting metrics, subtle tone changes when revenue dipped or investors applied pressure. That notebook became a habit, almost unconscious. Timestamp, context, commitment made, commitment revised. Not because I distrusted anyone, but because memory changes under stress. Colleagues saw me as steady infrastructure, the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who wouldn't cause friction. They underestimated something fundamental. Calm is not the same as unaware. I noticed when my recommendations were used without attribution. I noticed that my budget requests were delayed, while less profitable departments received increases. I noticed that when performance reviews praised my consistency, they avoided words like leadership or vision. I noticed, but I didn't react, because reacting would have disrupted the equilibrium, and equilibrium felt like security. The truth is, I believed in meritocracy. I believed that if I built enough value, if I made myself indispensable enough, I would naturally be protected. Protection through performance. It's a comforting belief. It's also fragile. To them, I was the safe choice, the stable option, the one who would absorb pressure quietly, the one who wouldn't escalate tension even if overlooked. They didn't see ambition because I didn't display it theatrically. They didn't see leverage because I never needed to use it. They didn't see risk in sidelining me because I never pushed back. I was reliable, I was useful, and in ways I didn't fully understand yet, I was disposable. If you're looking for the moment everything broke, there wasn't one. There was a small cut, so small that if you weren't paying attention, you would have missed it. It happened on a Tuesday morning in Q3. We were presenting revised revenue projections to the executive team. I had spent 3 weeks rebuilding our forecast model because market volatility had thrown off our earlier assumptions. My team and I ran scenario simulations late into the night. Best case, conservative case, stress-tested downturn. By the time we walked into the boardroom, the numbers were tight. I presented calmly, slide by slide, assumptions, methodology, margin impact, risk buffers. No one interrupted. When I finished, there was a pause, the kind that tells you the room understands the weight of what you've just shown them. Then my COO leaned forward. "This is exactly the strategic recalibration we discussed," he said. I remember the word landing softly in my chest. 3 weeks earlier, I had emailed him outlining the flaws in our old model. He had replied, "Let's keep it stable for now. No recalibration discussion, no strategic pivot conversation." But now, in front of the CEO and board advisors, it was suddenly collaborative foresight. No one corrected it. No one looked at me. The meeting moved on. Afterward, 2 directors congratulated him in the hallway for being proactive. I walked back to my office, opened my notebook, and wrote Q3 forecast revision, attribution shift. Language, we discussed. No prior approval. That was it. No confrontation. No bitterness. Just documentation. At the time, I told myself if it didn't matter, executive politics, optics, maybe he genuinely believed he had supported the shift. But here's what made it a cut instead of a scratch. Later that week, during a cross-department sync, the marketing lead pushed back on reduced acquisition spend. "Philip's team is being overly conservative," she said lightly. "We don't want fear-based forecasting." I explained the churn sensitivity and macro indicators, calmly, data-backed, neutral tone. She shrugged. Well, leadership alignment matters more than models. Leadership alignment. The same forecast my COO had just praised publicly was now Philip's caution. It was subtle. The credit floated upward. The accountability floated downward. I noticed a pattern forming. Not dramatic, not malicious, just convenient. When results were positive, they belonged to leadership alignment. When constraints were necessary, they belonged to analytics. And because I didn't protest, the structure solidified. There's something about being composed that invites projection. People assume you won't challenge narrative edits, that you care more about accuracy than optics, that you won't step into uncomfortable territory just to claim space. They were right. At least then, the small cut deepened during performance review season. My evaluation was strong, exceeded expectations, operational excellence, team stability, high trust factor. Then came the phrasing that lingered. Philip delivers exceptional work, though he could benefit from more visible executive presence. Visible. I asked what that meant. Speaking up earlier in strategic discussions. Driving broader vision. I nodded. It sounded reasonable. What I didn't say was this. I had proposed 2 strategic pivots in the past year. Both were delayed. Both were later introduced by others as refinements. Visibility, I realized, isn't about contribution. It's about timing and ownership. Still, I didn't push, because part of me believed in patience. If I kept delivering, the pattern would correct itself. People would eventually notice consistency over charisma. That belief kept me steady. But something shifted internally after that review. Not anger, awareness. The first small cut wasn't the attribution shift. It wasn't the we. It wasn't even the performance note. It was the realization that narrative control mattered more than factual accuracy. And I had voluntarily stayed out of that arena. That week, I began writing slightly more detailed notes in my notebook. Not just decisions, but context. Who proposed what? Exact language used. Timestamps. Follow-up commitments. I told myself it was good governance. Risk mitigation. Professional diligence. It was also something else. The beginning of distance. Because once you see how easily perception reshapes contribution, you can't unsee it. I still showed up the same way. Calm, precise, neutral. No one noticed the shift. But I stopped assuming fairness was automatic. And when assumptions change, behavior eventually follows. The first small cut didn't bleed. It simply marked the place where illusion thinned. What surprises most people isn't how disrespect begins. It's how quickly it becomes normal. After the first few attribution shifts, I expected the discomfort to fade. I assumed I'd either adapt or address it. Instead, I adapted. That's what high-functioning professionals do. We optimize around friction. We smooth it out. We convince ourselves it's strategic maturity. The pattern evolved gradually. In executive meetings, I noticed a shift in seating dynamics. I was asked to join earlier discussions less frequently. Instead, I was invited once frameworks had already been agreed upon. Can you validate these projections? Can you pressure test this before we present? I became the verifier, not the architect. When I recommended adjusting expansion targets due to early churn signals, my caution was reframed as operational conservatism. 2 weeks later, when a senior VP suggested responsible scaling, it was called prudence. Same data, different messenger, different reception. The room didn't feel hostile. That's what made it dangerous. No one rolled their eyes at me. No one dismissed me outright. There were no raised voices, just subtle reframing, strategic exclusion, quiet redistribution of credit. And because nothing was overt, it felt unreasonable to react. So I rationalized. Maybe leadership needed alignment more than precision. Maybe I should simplify my language. Maybe influence required a different tone. I even tried adjusting. In one meeting, I spoke earlier than usual, proactively highlighting a retention risk before it escalated. The response? Let's not get ahead of ourselves, my COO said gently. We'll cross that bridge if it becomes material. It became material 6 weeks later. By then, the narrative had shifted to, we underestimated early churn signals. Again, I wrote it down. What disturbed me wasn't that I was overlooked. It was then that I began participating in my own marginalization. I softened recommendations. I waited to be asked. I trimmed the context to avoid appearing negative. I told myself I was choosing diplomacy. In truth, I was choosing safety. There's an unspoken contract in many organizations. If you make life easier for leadership, they make your role stable. If you don't challenge power structures, you're considered loyal. And loyalty feels good. It feels moral. But loyalty without reciprocity is just quiet compliance. The normalization deepened during a product roadmap session. My team had flagged infrastructure strain under projected growth. Scaling without back-end reinforcement would introduce failure risk. I presented the analysis carefully. The CTO nodded but redirected. Let's keep momentum. Engineering can patch capacity reactively. Momentum. It's a powerful word. It makes caution sound like fear. 3 months later, we experienced 2 major outages. The internal email from leadership read, while analytics flagged potential strain, cross-functional prioritization favored growth acceleration. It was almost impressive. The disclaimer was subtle but clear. Analytics had concerns, but leadership decided otherwise, which meant responsibility had now been distributed. Upward credit, downward risk. I noticed something else too. Junior analysts began deferring less to my direction in meetings where executives were present. Not disrespectfully, but tentatively. They mirrored the room's cues. If leadership framed analytics as conservative, my team internalized that framing. Culture trickles downward. If the person at the top subtly minimizes you, others follow. Still, I didn't escalate. Why? Because the numbers remained strong. Because my compensation was competitive. Because my team trusted me. Because I believed consistency would eventually outweigh politics. That belief is comforting. It also keeps you stationary. There's a moment when you realize you're being tolerated more than valued. Not because you're incompetent, but because you don't disrupt hierarchy. I started to see my role clearly. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed tension quietly, the one who prevented crises without demanding recognition, the one who would never embarrass leadership publicly, the one who could be leaned on, but not necessarily elevated. And here's the part I didn't admit to myself then. Being underestimated gave me emotional cover. If expectations for visibility were low, I didn't have to compete in performative leadership. If I weren't seen as political, I could remain clean. It felt dignified, but dignity without agency is fragile. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to justify confrontation. It wasn't blatant enough to document as misconduct. It was ambient. Like background noise, you stopped noticing. And I did stop noticing, at least consciously, but my notebook grew thicker. Meeting by meeting, timestamp by timestamp, I recorded patterns, language shifts, decision reversals, ownership edits. Not because I planned to use them, but because something inside me no longer trusted the stability I had once assumed was permanent. Normalization is powerful. You can convince yourself that almost anything is acceptable if it arrives gradually enough. What I didn't understand yet was this. When you normalize being sidelined, you train others to believe you'll accept it indefinitely. And when organizations begin restructuring, when pressure rises, when budgets tighten, they don't protect the quiet stabilizer. They protect the visible power. I was still performing at the highest level, but performance had quietly become secondary. Narrative was winning, and I was letting it. There's a moment when you stop asking how others see you and start noticing the part you're expected to play. For me, that realization didn't arrive dramatically. It settled in slowly, like fog. By the start of Q4, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was being positioned, not maliciously, not strategically in a mastermind sense, but structurally. Every organization assigns roles beyond job titles. There's the visionary, the rainmaker, the crisis manager, the culture champion. And then there's the stabilizer, the reliable one, the person who ensures that when bold promises are made, someone in the background quietly calculates whether they're survivable. I had become that person. At first, it felt like trust. Leadership confided in me privately before earnings calls. I was asked to model best and worst case scenarios ahead of investor meetings. My projections were used to set bonus thresholds. But the closer I looked, the clearer the pattern became. I was consulted in private, excluded from the public. When strategy meetings involved external stakeholders, I wasn't invited. When celebratory announcements were made about growth targets, my name wasn't mentioned. But when targets were recalibrated, analytics were referenced. I wasn't the architect of ambition. I was the insurance policy against embarrassment. The role carried prestige without influence, responsibility without visibility, and the more I fulfilled it flawlessly, the more permanent it became. I remember a specific afternoon that crystallized it. We were discussing a potential acquisition, a small competitor promising tech, unstable financials. I had run deep due diligence on their revenue quality and churn liabilities. The risk was higher than leadership seemed comfortable acknowledging. In the meeting, I presented the findings calmly. Silence followed. Then my CEO smiled slightly and said, "Philip, we appreciate the thoroughness, but sometimes you have to trust the bigger picture." The bigger picture. It wasn't dismissal, it was framing. Translation: your job is to calculate the floor, not to define the ceiling. After the meeting, my COO stopped by my office. "You're invaluable," he said. "We need someone grounded. Not everyone has to be visionary." It sounded like reassurance. It was a classification. I began noticing how language subtly locked me in place. Steady hand, voice of reason, operational backbone, all compliments, all limiting. The irony is that I do think long-term. I do think strategically. I had ideas about restructuring incentive models, about realigning KPIs across departments to reduce internal friction. But I rarely pushed them forcefully, because pushing would have required stepping out of the assigned role. And stepping out risks friction. The role they assigned me was comfortable for them. It was also safe for me. If I remained the dependable one, I avoided political exposure. If I didn't compete for the spotlight, I would avoid rivalry. If I stayed in my lane, I preserved stability. There's a hidden bargain in that. You trade mobility for predictability upward. You trade influence for insulation. For years, I believed insulation was a strength. But insulation also means isolation. When conversations about succession planning occurred, I wasn't included. When leadership development programs launched, I wasn't nominated. I overheard once, unintentionally, someone describe me as best where he is. That phrase lingered longer than it should have. Best where he is, not best for what's next. Not the best for a broader scope. Just where he is. The role was clear, reliable, useful, invisible. And here's the part that matters most. I accepted it, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed performance would eventually override perception. I thought if I kept outperforming expectations, the narrative would adjust. What I didn't yet understand was that narratives solidify around comfort. And I was very comfortable with leadership exactly as I was. No threat, no friction, no challenge, just results. But results alone don't guarantee protection. They guarantee dependency. And dependency can be restructured. When budgets tighten, when boards demand cost optimization, when optics require decisive action, organizations don't evaluate worth emotionally. They evaluate positioning. And I had positioned myself as stabilizing infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical until someone decides to outsource it, or automate it, or remove it to signal a change. The role I was assigned wasn't accidental. It was reinforced by them, and by me. I didn't fight it. I perfected it. And that perfection made what happened next possible. The shift didn't happen the day I saw the list. It happened a few weeks earlier, quietly, almost invisibly. It was late, around 7:40 p.m. The office had thinned out to the hum of HVAC and distant keyboard taps. Chicago winters make the windows look darker than they are. The skyline reflected back at me like a muted mirror. I was reviewing headcount projections ahead of what leadership had called a cost optimization initiative. That was the phrase being used. Not layoffs, optimization. The dashboard was mid-migration between systems. Permissions were glitching. Temporary access levels were misaligned. IT had flagged it earlier in the week. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I was checking forecast alignment between projected revenue contraction and payroll allocation. Then I saw a tab that wasn't normally visible. Restructure _ phase 1 _ draft. I clicked it because that's what analysts do when they see anomalies. The sheet opened. Department breakdown, salary bands, risk scoring, retention value metrics. My eyes moved down automatically, scanning the columns. And then they stopped. Name, Philip A. Mercer. Column, priority reduction, tier 1. For a moment, nothing registered. There was no adrenaline, no surge of disbelief, just stillness. I checked the adjacent column. Performance index, 4.9 out of 5. Retention impact score, high. Replacement complexity, severe. Cost savings, annualized, significant. The data contradicted the decision. I scrolled upward to understand the logic. There was a weighting formula. Performance contributed 30%. Compensation cost contributed 40%. Leadership redundancy potential contributed 30%. I reread that phrase. Leadership redundancy potential. The hidden variable. It wasn't about output. It was about perceived replaceability within the executive structure. My department had 2 senior managers beneath me. Both strong, both less expensive, both more politically aligned with the COO. The math made sense, not ethically. Structurally, the numbers proved my results, yet the list told another story. Performance didn't matter when decisions had already been made behind closed doors. I leaned back in my chair. The skyline outside hadn't changed. The building was still quiet. Nothing in the physical world reacted to what I had just seen. That's what made it surreal. For years, I believed excellence was insulation. But insulation only works against predictable weather. This wasn't weather. This was architecture. I didn't panic. Instead, something precise happened internally. A recalibration. I opened my black notebook. Timestamp 7:52 p.m. Accessed restructure _phase 1 _draft via migration glitch. Tier 1 reduction candidate. I wrote the weighting breakdown carefully, exact percentages. Then I closed the tab. I didn't download it. I didn't email it. I didn't take screenshots. I simply understood. There's a particular clarity that comes when illusion dissolves. It's not dramatic. It's surgical. The narrative I had built about meritocracy, about performance protection, collapsed quietly. Not because I was being unfairly targeted out of spite, but because I had misread the game. The organization wasn't a scoreboard. It was a structure of power distribution, and I had optimized for value creation, not positional leverage. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send messages. I didn't even tell my wife immediately. I went home, ate dinner, asked about her day, helped our son with math homework. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I stopped viewing myself as protected infrastructure. I began viewing myself as a variable, and variables can move. The next morning, I behaved exactly the same. Calm in meetings, measured in tone, thorough in analysis. No one noticed anything different. But internally, silence was no longer a habit. It was an assessment. When you realize you're already marked expendable, fear loses some of its leverage. What can they threaten you with? The thing they've already decided to do. There's a freedom in that awareness, not recklessness, freedom. For the first time, I considered questions I had avoided. What leverage do I actually hold? What knowledge exists only because I built it? What decisions have I documented that contradict official narratives? What would restructuring look like if I weren't reacting, but choosing? The shift wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was perspective. I finally understood my role fully. And once you understand the structure, you can decide whether to remain within it or reposition yourself entirely. That night in the quiet office, looking at my name at the top of a reduction list, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt informed. And information, when processed without panic, becomes power. After you see something you weren't meant to see, you have 2 options: react or recalibrate. I chose recalibration. The morning after discovering the draft layoff list, I arrived at the office at the same time I always did. 7:15 a.m. I made coffee, reviewed overnight reports, answered emails with my usual precision. Nothing outward changed. That was intentional. Silence, up until that point, had been my default temperament. I avoided unnecessary friction because I believed stability created influence over time. But now, silence had a different quality. It was deliberate. When you understand you're already positioned as expendable, you stop trying to prove indispensability emotionally. You start assessing leverage structurally. In meetings that week, I spoke less, but observed more. The COO seemed unusually relaxed. Budget conversations carried an undercurrent of finality. HR had increased its presence in strategic syncs under the guise of culture alignment. I noticed who made eye contact when cost optimization was mentioned. I noticed who didn't. No one looked at me differently. because no one assumed I knew. That was the advantage. In one executive meeting, the CEO said, "We need to ensure that high performers feel secure during this transition." Secure, the word floated in the room like a reassurance theater. I nodded slightly, taking notes in my black notebook. Secure. Tier 1 reduction. Both truths existed simultaneously. That's when something subtle but powerful shifted inside me. I stopped personalizing the decision. It wasn't about dislike. It wasn't about incompetence. It was about hierarchy management. If my compensation was high and my influence was quiet, eliminating me signaled fiscal discipline without political risk. Promoting one of my direct reports, who had closer alignment with the COO, maintained continuity. Efficient, cold, understandable. And because I understood it, I stopped feeling injured by it. Instead, I began thinking strategically. Silence became cover. When executives assume you're unaware, they become less guarded around you. Conversations sharpened. In a hallway exchange, I overheard the phrase, flattening leadership layers. Another day, finance asked for detailed documentation of proprietary forecasting models for contingency planning. Contingency, I provided documentation carefully. Not incomplete, not defensive, just structured. But I noticed something else. Much of the architecture behind our predictive models wasn't fully captured in formal SOPs. The nuance lived in institutional memory, in judgment calls, in calibrated assumptions that only experience refines. That nuance lived primarily with me. For years, I had freely shared it, mentored analysts, walked managers through model sensitivities. Now I have become selective, not secretive, selective. There's a difference. When asked broad questions, I answered broadly. When asked for strategic recalibration insights, I deferred slightly. We'd need deeper scenario modeling to confirm. Translation. The shortcut you're hoping for isn't available instantly. Again, nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational, just measured. They interpreted my restraint as steadiness under pressure. In reality, it was inventory. I was taking stock of what knowledge was transferable, what relationships were transactional, what risks existed beyond payroll reduction, what documentation contradicts official performance narratives. My notebook filled faster that month than it had in years. Time-stamped leadership language, budget justifications, performance review inconsistencies. Not because I intended to expose anyone, but clarity requires records. The emotional shift was the most important part. Before seeing the list, my silence came from trust. After seeing it, my silence came from choice. Trust is passive. Choice is active. That distinction changes posture. Colleagues began commenting on how calm I seemed, despite restructuring rumors. One manager said, "You're handling this better than most." I smiled slightly. I focus on what I can control. That was true. What I could control was preparation. What I could control was positioning. What I could control was timing. The fear that usually accompanies potential job loss didn't dominate me, because psychologically, I had already crossed the line. The worst case scenario had a shape now. It had my name on it. And once something has shape, it loses its power to haunt abstractly. Silence, when misunderstood, looks like weakness. But silence, when chosen, is data collection. And data, over time, compounds. They believed I was the steady infrastructure absorbing tension quietly. They didn't realize that infrastructure can also reroute. The system still functioned. The meetings still ran. The forecasts were still accurate. But beneath that consistency, alignment was shifting internally. I wasn't waiting to be saved by performance anymore. I was preparing to move without noise. And when you move without noise, people rarely see it coming. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. If I had started acting differently, speaking sharply, withdrawing from meetings, signaling defensiveness, it would have triggered curiosity. Instead, I refined my predictability. I arrived early, delivered reports on time, offered neutral insights. But behind that routine, I began building options. The first step wasn't external, it was structural mapping. I asked myself a simple question. If I left tomorrow, voluntarily or not, what would actually break? Not theoretically, operationally. I reviewed our analytics infrastructure line by line. Data ingestion pipelines, forecast recalibration logic, churn sensitivity assumptions, investor reporting dashboards. Most of it was documented, but documentation and understanding aren't the same thing. Over the years, I had embedded strategic judgment into the system, manual overrides during volatility, scenario triggers that activated based on macro indicators, calibration factors adjusted quarterly based on client behavior patterns. Those layers weren't secrets. They were just experience. Experience doesn't export cleanly. I began separating what was transferable from what was interpretive. Transferable knowledge I documented cleanly and professionally. I wanted no accusation of sabotage or gatekeeping. My moral code mattered. If I left, I would leave with integrity. But interpretive nuance, the why behind certain thresholds, the reasoning behind risk buffers that I kept at the level of conversation, not automation. It wasn't about withholding. It was about recognizing value. Meanwhile, I quietly updated my external presence. LinkedIn profile revised, not aggressively, just precisely. Metrics quantified clearly, cross-functional impact articulated, no emotional undertones. I reconnected with former colleagues, not to complain, not to signal distress, just to check in, congratulate the promotions, exchange industry insights. Opportunities don't emerge from panic. They emerge from positioning. At the same time, I paid closer attention internally. Who was rising? Who was being groomed? One of my senior managers, David, had begun getting invited to executive pre-reads I used to attend. He was sharp, ambitious, politically fluent in a way I never prioritized. I didn't resent him, but I recognized the shift. I scheduled more one-on-ones with him, not to challenge, but to observe. I asked about his long-term goals. He spoke about broader operational leadership, about scaling teams. His tone held something subtle, expectation. That told me enough. Parallel to this, finance requested deeper breakdowns of compensation to output ratios across departments. I complied thoroughly, but I also ran my own private models. What would restructuring look like if performance weighting increased to 50%? What if retention risk carried heavier financial penalties? In almost every alternate configuration, my elimination reduced short-term payroll, but increased long-term volatility risk. I didn't send those models. I kept them because timing matters. Preparation also meant financial prudence. My wife and I reviewed savings, adjusted liquidity buffers, paid down remaining debt more aggressively. I increased contributions to emergency reserves. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, dependency was shrinking. One evening, I revisited the restructure_phase1_draft tab, not to confirm my name, but to study patterns. Other tier 1 names weren't low performers either. They were high earners with contained political capital. It wasn't about eliminating weakness. It was about eliminating expensive stability in favor of flexible alignment, understanding that reframed everything. This wasn't personal. It was an architectural simplification. An architecture can be redesigned. The most important preparation, though, was psychological. I rehearsed the possibility of being called into a room. I imagined the tone, the phrasing. The HR representative is sitting slightly angled. The folder was placed gently on the table. I practiced how I would respond. Calm, measured, no visible surprise. No argument about performance, because arguing performance would signal a misunderstanding of the real decision. Instead, I prepared to ask structured questions. What narrative will accompany this decision? What severance structure is proposed? What documentation accompanies a performance assessment? Preparation isn't paranoia. It's clarity without panic. What they never noticed was that my silence wasn't passive anymore. It was layered. I wasn't waiting to see if I survived. I was evaluating whether survival in that structure even made sense. The irony is this: the more prepared I became to leave, the less anxious I felt. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Preparation dissolves uncertainty. By the time phase 1 rumors intensified, I had already detached emotionally from the assumption of permanence. Not from my team, not from the work, but from the illusion of protection. One afternoon, as I closed my notebook, I realized something profound. If they removed me, I would still be intact. My skills weren't confined to a title. My value wasn't confined to a hierarchy. And most importantly, my understanding of the system now exceeded their understanding of my awareness. That asymmetry is quiet power. They believed I was a steady infrastructure. They didn't realize that infrastructure can also become an architect. The real leverage didn't reveal itself in a dramatic discovery. It revealed itself in alignment. By that point, I had already accepted the likelihood of being part of phase one. I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. I was analyzing structurally. And then something subtle clicked. It happened during a late evening review of our investor reporting pipeline. Our company's valuation narrative rested heavily on forecast stability. Predictability was our selling point. We weren't the flashiest SaaS firm, but we were reliable. Recurring revenue, controlled churn, disciplined scaling, those claims weren't marketing exaggerations. They were the direct result of the forecasting architecture I had built over 6 years. Every board presentation relied on models calibrated through judgment calls that weren't obvious to casual observers. I began asking myself a different question. If I were removed abruptly, what would happen to forecast confidence over the next 2 quarters? Not operationally, perceptually. Most leaders think in terms of functionality. Can the system run? Fewer think in terms of interpretive continuity. Can the system be trusted without its primary calibrator? Trust is more fragile than functionality. You can run a model without understanding its sensitivities. You just won't know when it's wrong. That was the private reveal. My value wasn't in execution. It was in interpretive stability. There are thresholds in our churn prediction model that adjust based on macroeconomic volatility signals. Subtle weightings applied each quarter manually after reviewing qualitative customer behavior. Those adjustments weren't proprietary secrets. They were embedded judgment. If removed, the team could continue operating. But the margin of error would widen. And in a tightening market, widened error margins ripple quickly. Missed earnings guidance, investor skepticism, compressed valuation. That wasn't sabotage. It was math. For years, I had framed my role as service. Now, I understand it as leverage. The second layer of clarity came from documentation. My black notebook contained time-stamped records of strategic decisions that contradicted public messaging, instances where leadership overrode risk flags for growth optics. Nothing unethical, nothing illegal, but enough to demonstrate that certain volatility wasn't unforeseeable. That mattered, not as a threat, but as a narrative balance. If restructuring framed analytics leadership as redundant posting costs, I had evidence showing strategic risk awareness had consistently originated from my office. Narratives matter during transitions. Boards ask questions. Investors scrutinize shifts. Removing a high-performing analytics head during a stability-first messaging cycle introduces cognitive dissonance. That dissonance was leverage. The third realization was more personal. Over the past month, 3 separate recruiters had reached out. Coincidentally, perhaps not. Market signals travel quickly when restructuring rumors circulate. Previously, I would have ignored them. This time, I engaged in quiet conversations, not promises, exploratory dialogues. One role stood out. VP of Strategic Finance at a competitor with aggressive expansion plans. They lacked robust predictive modeling. They needed structure. The compensation wasn't dramatically higher, but the influence scope was. More importantly, it was offered proactively, not reactively. That shifted my posture internally. Leverage isn't only internal documentation, it's external optionality. By the time phase 1 rumors intensified further, I wasn't clinging to survival. I was evaluating timing. The final piece of the reveal came during a budget alignment session. Finance proposed accelerating cost reductions to signal fiscal discipline before earnings. Signal, there it was again. Optics preceding stability. If I remained silent and waited to be cut, the narrative would position my departure as strategic efficiency. If I moved first, calmly, intentionally, the narrative would shift. Executive departures framed voluntarily often signal leadership recalibration. Executive reductions signal contraction. Subtle difference. Major market perception impact. I went home that night and told my wife everything. Not dramatically, just facts. Draft list, tier 1, weighting formula. She listened quietly, then asked a simple question. If they've already decided, why are you waiting? Not accusatory, curious. And in that question, the final layer was clarified. I wasn't waiting out of fear. I was waiting out a habit. Habit of loyalty. Habit of patience. The habit of believing fairness corrects itself. But systems don't self-correct. They optimize for power equilibrium. And I now had 3 forms of leverage. Interpretive dependency embedded in forecasting architecture. Documented narrative context contradicts redundancy framing. External opportunity aligned with my actual strategic capacity. None of it required confrontation. None of it required exposure. It simply required a decision. The private reveal wasn't exciting. It was composure. For the first time since seeing my name on that list, I felt something close to certainty. Not about staying, about choice. When you discover you were never protected by performance, you have two responses: desperation or design. I chose design. There's a moment when analysis stops being useful, not because you lack information, but because more information won't change the structure. I had everything I needed: the draft layoff list, the weighting formula, the interpretive leverage is embedded in the forecasting system, the documented history of strategic overrides, the external offer, still informal but very real. What remained was a single question: do I wait to be removed, or do I remove myself? On the surface, waiting made sense. If I allowed phase one to unfold naturally, I'd likely receive severance. A clean narrative, public messaging that framed my departure as part of broader restructuring. Financially safe, predictable, controlled, but waiting also meant accepting their framing of my value. Redundant leadership layer, cost optimization, replaceable infrastructure. That narrative would follow me, subtly, quietly, into every reference call and industry conversation. Even if no one said it directly, the implication would exist. I wasn't afraid of unemployment. I was unwilling to accept misclassification. The alternative was more complex: resign voluntarily, frame the departure strategically, control the message, but that required timing precision. If I resigned too early, leadership might accelerate phase one and minimize severance for others. If I resigned too late, I risked being publicly positioned as part of the cost reduction anyway. So I studied the calendar. Quarterly earnings were 4 weeks away. Investor sentiment was cautious but stable. Internal morale was fragile. Rumors circulating but not confirmed. If I moved before earnings, leadership would need to explain the departure without triggering market anxiety, which meant they would frame it carefully, perhaps even generously. The competitor's offer was formalized 2 days later. Compensation aligned, equity upside is stronger. Title: VP of Strategic Finance and Predictive Strategy. Not just analytics, strategy. That mattered more than money. I took a long walk that evening along Lake Michigan. Wind sharp, thoughts sharper. For years, I believed loyalty was endurance, but loyalty without reciprocity becomes stagnation. I asked myself one final question. If phase one didn't exist, if I had never seen the list, would I still consider leaving? The answer surprised me. Yes. Because the role I had been assigned was too small for the scope I could carry. The list didn't create dissatisfaction. It clarified it. That distinction removed bitterness from the equation. I wasn't leaving to punish. I was leaving to align. The irreversible option wasn't resignation itself. It was narrative control. Once I submitted the notice, the internal calculus would change permanently. There would be no retreat to comfortable invisibility, no return to stabilizing infrastructure. I would step into visible leadership somewhere else. That required confidence, not anger. The next morning, I drafted a resignation letter. Concise, professional, no reference to restructuring, no emotional undertones. I positioned it as a strategic growth opportunity aligned with long-term vision expansion. I scheduled a private meeting with the CEO and COO for the following week, before any phase one announcements were scheduled internally. The timing was deliberate. When you act before a decision is executed against you, you alter the power dynamic. They would enter the room believing I was unaware. They would leave, understanding I had already chosen. There's a quiet strength in irreversible decisions, not reckless ones, measured ones. I didn't inform my team yet. I didn't update LinkedIn. I didn't signal externally. Everything remained steady. But internally, the decision was complete. I wasn't going to wait to see if I survived their restructuring. I was going to demonstrate that their restructuring didn't define my trajectory. There's a difference between being cut and cutting alignment yourself. That difference changes posture. When I closed my notebook that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not because I was escaping, but because I was no longer negotiating with uncertainty. The decision had weight, but it also had clarity, and clarity is heavier than fear. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, internally. When you act out of panic, movements are sharp and visible. When you act out of clarity, they're almost invisible. I had scheduled the meeting with the CEO and COO for Tuesday morning, 9 a.m., a neutral slot, not the end of the day, not pre-weekend. Neutral timing avoids emotional framing. In the days leading up to it, I didn't behave differently. I delivered a forecast adjustment ahead of schedule. I provided finance with the compensation breakdown they'd requested. I even offered input on restructuring communications language when asked. If anyone sensed distance, they didn't show it. Meanwhile, I structured my exit deliberately. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully. Non-compete clauses, non-solicitation terms, severance triggers, change of control provisions. There were no legal surprises, but clarity removes vulnerability. I consulted an employment attorney, not to threaten, not to escalate, just to understand leverage boundaries. Quiet preparation. I also mapped out transition architecture. If I were leaving voluntarily, I would not sabotage. That was non-negotiable. My moral code mattered more than ego. But transition timing, that could be calibrated. I outlined a 60-day handover framework, documentation updates, model walkthroughs, stakeholder briefings. That level of structure would signal professionalism and reduce any instinct to reframe my departure negatively. Because when someone leaves with dignity and structure, it's difficult to portray them as redundant. On Monday evening, I sat in my office alone. Again, similar to the night I saw the list. Different energy. I opened the restructuring draft one last time. My name was still there. Tier 1. I didn't feel anything dramatic, just confirmation. The next morning, I entered the executive conference room precisely at 8:58 a.m. The CEO was reviewing notes. The COO had his laptop open. Both looked relaxed. I began without build-up. I wanted to speak with you directly before broader announcements roll out, I said evenly. I've accepted a leadership opportunity externally and will be submitting formal notice today. Silence. Not shocked. Calculation. The CEO blinked once. The COO leaned back slightly. That's unexpected, the CEO said carefully. May I ask why now? I held eye contact calmly. It aligns with my long-term strategic growth. The scope expands beyond analytics into broader financial architecture. It's the right time. I didn't reference restructuring. I didn't reference the draft list. I didn't accuse. That omission carried weight because executives are trained to read what isn't said. The COO asked, "Is this about the cost optimization initiative?" There it was. I paused, not dramatically, just enough. My decision is forward-looking, I replied, not reactive. That sentence shifted the power dynamic entirely. Forward-looking, not reactive. Translation, I'm not being pushed. I'm moving. They exchanged a brief glance. In that glance, I saw something subtle. Adjustment. The conversation pivoted quickly to transition planning, timeline, messaging, investor communication implications, because they understood immediately what this meant. If they announced phase 1 reductions after my voluntary departure, it would look like a contraction. If they announced my departure first, framed as growth, they could position restructuring as strategic refinement. My exit gave them narrative cover, and they knew it. The CEO's tone softened. "We value what you've built here," he said. "We'd like to discuss retention incentives. Is there flexibility?" That was the moment of confirmation. Tier 1 reduction candidate. Now a retention discussion, not because my performance changed overnight, because leverage shifted. I declined politely. "My decision is firm. I'm committed to ensuring a seamless transition. No arrogance, no triumph, just steadiness." The meeting ended with professionalism. No tension, no confrontation. As I walked back to my office, nothing outward had changed. But internally, the architecture had flipped. I wasn't waiting to be evaluated anymore. I had evaluated. The rest of the week moved quietly. HR-coordinated messaging. We crafted a joint announcement emphasizing strategic opportunity and strong succession planning. Strong succession planning. The phrase made me almost smile. My departure would now validate internal strength instead of signal redundancy. Silence, when timed correctly, becomes influence. No one in the broader organization knew about the draft list. No one knew how close the narrative had come to defining me differently. They only saw what was presented. A calm executive choosing growth. Behind that calm was weeks of documentation, analysis, and deliberate positioning. But none of that needed to be visible. The power of moving in silence is this. By the time others understand the shift, it's already complete. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they unfold as a subtle imbalance. The company-wide announcement went out on Thursday morning. Subject line, leadership transition, Philip Mercer. The message was polished. Strategic opportunity, gratitude for foundational contributions, confidence in internal succession. My inbox filled quickly. Colleagues are expressing surprise. Analysts thanking me for mentorship. A few executives were writing carefully worded notes that felt measured. David, my senior manager, was announced as interim head of analytics. Efficient, expected. What no one outside the executive room understood was how tightly timed everything had become. Phase 1 restructuring announcements, which had been tentatively scheduled for the following week, were suddenly recalibrated. HR needed to reassess optics. Investor communications needed resequencing. My departure had altered the narrative rhythm. Within days, I noticed subtle tremors. Finance requested a deeper walkthrough of quarterly forecast sensitivities, earlier than planned. David scheduled additional calibration sessions with me, asking more granular questions than usual. How do you determine when to manually adjust volatility buffers? He asked one afternoon. Pattern recognition, I replied calmly. You'll develop it over time. That wasn't evasive. It was honest. Interpretive judgment cannot be transferred instantly. Meanwhile, rumors about restructuring intensified across departments. But without my name attached to a reduction list, internal speculation lacked the focal point. My voluntary exit had created ambiguity. Ambiguity delays panic, and panic was what leadership had hoped to avoid. The first visible consequence came during an investor pre-read rehearsal. I was still attending, given my transition period. The CEO referenced forecast stability, as usual, but this time an investor advisor asked, "With Philip transitioning, how confident are we in model continuity?" The room tightened slightly, not visibly, but perceptibly. Confidence had always been implicit. Now it required articulation. David answered well, technically correct, thorough. But confidence derived from inherited systems feels different than confidence built from authorship. Trust, once attached to a person, doesn't migrate seamlessly to a title. That's the cost of eliminating or losing stabilizing infrastructure. Again, no chaos, no collapse, just increased scrutiny. Inside the company, managers began recalculating their own vulnerability. If a high-performing executive could leave unexpectedly, what did that signal about stability? Retention anxiety spreads quietly. A week later, Phase 1 restructuring was announced, smaller in scope than originally drafted. 3 Tier 1 names had shifted to Tier 2. I didn't ask why, but I understood the mechanism. Removing me voluntarily had already satisfied part of the cost optimization target. Leadership could reduce visible cuts elsewhere to preserve morale optics. Cost savings achieved, but the narrative softened. David stopped by my office one afternoon, closing the door behind him. "Did you know about the restructuring before you resigned?" he asked carefully. I met his gaze evenly. I knew enough to evaluate my options. That was true. He nodded slowly. "I'm trying to understand how to position the team moving forward." His tone held a new weight, less ambition, more responsibility. "You position them with clarity," I said. "Forecast conservatively. Protect credibility before growth." Advice I had always given. Now it carried a different gravity. Externally, I finalized onboarding with the new company. Public announcements scheduled strategically to align with their earnings optimism cycle. Timing matters in both directions. The final consequence unfolded subtly but meaningfully. 2 senior analysts from my team submitted resignations within a month of mine. Not dramatically. Better opportunities. Expanded scope. Talent follows perceived stability and leadership trust. When stabilizers exit, confidence recalibrates. Again, no explosion. Just erosion. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt unsurprised. Organizations often underestimate the psychological weight of quiet leadership. Not the loud motivator. Not the charismatic visionary. The calm axis around which decisions stabilize. When that axis shifts, the room tilts slightly. Not enough to fall. Enough to adjust. By the time my final day approached, the company was still operationally strong. Forecasts still ran. Reports still generated. But the interpretive center had moved. And everyone, consciously or not, felt it. Consequences rarely look like destruction. They look like a recalibration. And recalibration always has a cost. Regret doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it arrives as a subtle urgency. 3 weeks after phase one was announced, the market shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. A competitor revised guidance downward due to churn acceleration in a key vertical. Investors reacted cautiously across the sector. Our stock dipped 4% in a day. Nothing catastrophic, but in environments built on predictability, even small tremors trigger scrutiny. I was 2 weeks into my transition period, splitting time between handover meetings and onboarding calls with my new company. That Tuesday morning, finance requested an emergency forecast sensitivity analysis, earlier than scheduled, broader scope. What happens if mid-market churn increases by 1.5% under tightened budgets? The CFO asked in a hurried tone. I walked through the scenario calmly. Under current calibration assumptions, we absorb it within guidance, I said. If macro volatility extends into Q3, we'd need to adjust buffers. The word adjust lingered. After the call, the COO stopped by my office again, less composed than usual. Looking back, he began carefully. Were there early indicators we didn't weigh heavily enough? There it was, retrospective caution, not an accusation, not blame, just reconsideration. Yes, I said evenly. We discussed mid-market fragility during the roadmap acceleration push. I didn't reference dates. I didn't reference my notebook. He nodded slowly. I remember. Of course he did. Memory sharpens when pressure returns. The following week, during another investor Q&A rehearsal, the CEO asked directly, "Do you feel confident the team can maintain calibration quality after you transition fully?" It wasn't defensive. It was honest. I answered without ego. They're capable. It will take experience to replicate interpretive adjustments. There may be a learning curve. Learning curve. A diplomatic phrase for a volatility window. That evening, I received an unexpected call from the CEO. Informal tone. "Philip, I want to be transparent. There's concern at the board level about continuity. If there's flexibility in your timeline or consulting capacity, we'd like to explore it." There it was. Not retention incentives this time. Not counter offers. Continuity negotiation. Tier 1 reduction candidate. Now strategic continuity risk. I listened carefully. "I'm committed to ensuring a strong transition," I replied. Beyond my notice period, my focus shifts fully to the new role. Silence on the other end. "Not hostile. Resigned." "I understand," he said quietly. That was the moment I realized something important. It wasn't that they hadn't valued me. They had miscalculated my positioning. In their model, I was experiencing stability. In reality, I was embedded in interpretive infrastructure. Those are not the same thing. Cost optimization works cleanly when outputs are modular. It destabilizes when judgment is centralized. By the time the board recognized that nuance, the narrative had already shifted. My successor had been publicly announced. Restructuring had been messaged as refinement. Investor communication had stabilized around my voluntary departure framing. Reversing that now would signal inconsistency. And inconsistency erodes confidence faster than churn. Too late to fix it. Not because bridges were burned, but because the timing had passed. Internally, I sensed tension growing subtly. More cross-checking of forecasts, longer review cycles, increased executive oversight. Not because David was incapable, because trust was recalibrating. Trust takes years to build, minutes to question, months to restore. In my final week, the CFO stopped by personally. "I'll be honest," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "In hindsight, perhaps we underestimated the stabilizing role you played." Underestimated, a word I had lived inside for years. I nodded gently. "Organizations evolve," I said. "So do people." There was no bitterness in my voice, because by then, the outcome no longer threatened me. Regret is complicated in corporate settings. Rarely does anyone say, "We were wrong." Instead, they adjust language, reframe strategy, increase oversight, offer consulting bridges. But structural timing remains unforgiving. Once I chose alignment elsewhere, once I shifted the narrative from reduction to growth, the architecture locked. The system moved forward without me. They adapted. They would survive. But they would do so with a learning curve they hadn't priced in. And pricing errors, even small ones, accumulate. Not catastrophically, gradually. By the time my badge deactivated, the room felt different. Quieter. More cautious. Not unstable. Just aware. And awareness, once introduced, doesn't disappear. It lingers. Too late to fix it. Not because destruction occurred, but because the miscalculation had already been absorbed. My last official day arrived without ceremony. No farewell party, no dramatic speeches, just scheduled transition meetings, final documentation uploads, and a quiet lunch with my team. Around 4:15 p.m., I received a calendar invite from the CEO. Subject, quick check-in. No agenda. I knew what it was. His office overlooked the river. Late afternoon light reflected against the glass buildings across from us. The room felt the same as it always had. Controlled, deliberate. He gestured for me to sit. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. I'm going to ask you something directly, he said. When did you know? There it was. Not an accusation, not hostility, curiosity. I didn't deflect. I became aware of restructuring scenarios during the system migration, I said calmly, enough to understand the direction. He studied my face carefully. And that influenced your timing. Yes. No embellishment, no edge. He exhaled slowly. I wish you'd come to me. The statement wasn't defensive, it sounded reflective. I considered it, I replied, but I also understood the constraints you were managing. That was true. Executive roles operate within board pressure, investor optics, and cost modeling. Individual conversations rarely override structural incentives. He nodded. You were never about performance risk, he said. It was the cost structure. I understand, I answered. There was no need to debate it. We both knew performance wasn't the variable. He leaned back in his chair. You handled this professionally, he continued. You could have escalated it. You didn't. I met his gaze steadily. Escalation wouldn't have changed the architecture. That was the closest I came to confrontation. Not heated, just factual. He gave a faint, almost reluctant smile. You're probably right. Silence settled again, but it wasn't tense. It felt equal. For the first time in years, we weren't operating inside assigned roles. I wasn't the stabilizer. He wasn't the unquestioned architect. We were simply two professionals acknowledging structural misalignment. He asked one more question. If circumstances had been different, if we'd repositioned earlier, would you have stayed? I considered it honestly. Yes, I said, if influence had matched responsibility. He absorbed that. No defensiveness, just recognition. The truth in that statement wasn't an attack. It was clarity. For years, I had carried operational weight without strategic authority. It wasn't resentment. It was imbalance. Imbalance eventually resolves itself, either internally or through departure. We stood to shake hands. Congratulations on the new role, he said. They're gaining something substantial. There was sincerity in it. Thank you, I replied. I hope the next quarter stabilizes smoothly. A small exchange, measured. Then I walked out. No slammed doors, no dramatic exits, no exposed documents, no speeches about fairness, just alignment correction. The confrontation wasn't about proving I had been wronged. It was about acknowledging that the system had priced me incorrectly. And when pricing is wrong, markets adjust. As I cleared my desk, I slipped my black notebook into my briefcase. 6 years of observations, not weapons, not ammunition, just record. Walking through the lobby for the last time, badge in hand, I didn't feel triumph. I felt equilibrium. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is one where no one raises their voice because heat clouds perception. Calm reveals structure, and structure, once seen clearly, doesn't require argument. It requires movement. 6 months later, my life looks quieter, not smaller, clearer. My new office doesn't overlook a river. It overlooks a construction corridor, cranes, scaffolding, half-finished structures. It feels appropriate. I'm no longer head of analytics. My title now includes strategic finance and predictive architecture. Architecture, the word still resonates. In this company, I was brought in not to stabilize something fully built, but to shape what's being constructed. The difference is subtle, but it changes posture. In my first executive meeting here, I spoke early, not aggressively, simply without waiting. When I outlined risk-adjusted growth pacing, the CEO didn't reframe it as conservatism. He asked follow-up questions, not to contain the insight, to expand it. Influence matched responsibility. That alignment feels light. I still carry my black notebook. Old habits don't disappear. They evolve. Now it contains fewer timestamps of misalignment and more sketches of structural design, revised incentive flows, revised data governance loops, and new forecasting models built collaboratively rather than defensively. Something else has changed. I no longer equate invisibility with professionalism. There's a difference between being composed and being minimized. For years, I confused the two. Quiet strength doesn't require silence. It requires precision. In this role, I've learned to articulate risk without apology, to claim authorship without aggression, to set boundaries without escalation. That shift didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. When I think back to seeing my name at the top of that Tier 1 reduction list, I don't feel resentment. I feel gratitude. Because it exposed something I had been unwilling to examine. I had outsourced my career narrative to performance metrics. I believed numbers would defend me. Numbers don't defend. They inform. Power structures interpret. If influence and interpretation don't align with your contribution, mispricing happens, and mispricing surfaces. I also see my former company differently now. They weren't villains. They were optimizing within constraints. I was optimizing within assumptions. Both were incomplete. The quiet dominance people sometimes talk about isn't about winning. It's about knowing your weight without announcing it. It's about understanding leverage before you need to use it. It's about moving without spectacle. My former team still reaches out occasionally. David once called to discuss a volatility recalibration issue. I offered perspective, not because I needed to prove anything, but because professional bridges matter. There's no bitterness, just distance and perspective. The biggest transformation wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer seek protection through indispensability. I seek alignment through positioning. If I ever see my name on a list like that again, it won't surprise me. Because I now understand that stability isn't granted, it's negotiated. And negotiation requires awareness, not noise. The man who sat halfway down the conference table believed excellence would eventually speak loudly enough. The man I am now speaks when necessary, and designs structures where excellence is visible by design. No more assigned roles, no more quiet containment, just calibrated presence. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a dramatic moral. Expose them, outsmart them, win publicly. But that was never the point. I didn't destroy a company. I didn't embarrass leadership. I didn't leak documents or burn bridges. I simply corrected the alignment. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about layoffs. It was about mispricing. For years, I believed performance was protection. That if I delivered consistently, if my department outperformed projections, if my team stayed stable, if the numbers were clean, then I would be structurally safe. But organizations don't operate on fairness alone. They operate on leverage, optics, timing, and cost structures. When I gained access to the internal system and saw my name first on the layoff list, despite being the top performer, I understood something uncomfortable thing. The numbers proved my results, yet the list told another story. Performance didn't matter when decisions had already been made behind closed doors. That realization could have made me bitter. Instead, it made me strategic. Here's the truth most people avoid. If your value lives only in execution, you are easier to replace than you think. If your influence doesn't match your responsibility, you are misaligned. If you never shape the narrative around your contribution, someone else will. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing when silence is a habit and when it needs to become a choice. It's about preparing before panic arrives. It's about moving before you're moved. And most importantly, it's about understanding that loyalty must be reciprocal. I don't regret the years I spent building that forecasting architecture. I don't regret mentoring my team. I don't regret trusting the system. But I do regret how long it took me to realize that excellence without positioning is fragile. If you find yourself in a similar place, steady, reliable, indispensable, but unseen, ask yourself something honestly. Are you valued, or are you simply convenient? There's a difference, and that difference becomes visible the moment pressure rises. You don't need to shout. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to prove anyone wrong. You just need to understand your leverage before someone else evaluates it for you. I left without noise. They adjusted without collapse. Life moved forward. That's how most real power shifts happen, quietly. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever discovered that your performance wasn't the real factor in a decision about your future? And if so, did you wait or did you move first?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.